The entry on the wax tablet is cold. A junior quaestor filed it after the fact in the summer of 255 BC. Ships sent from Africa, 364. Rowers and marines aboard, over 100,000. Ships that reached Sicily, 80. The numbers are sterile by design. They are the language of a state that logs men in the same column as grain and iron. But read them again. Translate them out of the ledger and into the water. More than 100,000 men. Sailors, legionaries, soldiers already saved once from Africa, gone in a single afternoon. Over 280 warships of the Republic broken open on the rocks of southern Sicily. No Carthaginian admiral did this. No fleet ambushed them. There was no battle at all. This was the deadliest day at sea in the recorded history of the ancient world, and Rome built it herself. The cause was Rome's proudest invention. The weapon that had handed her the sea now came to collect on the loan. The machine that produced the disaster was the Roman state at war. A system that could take a defeat, read the casualty rolls, and answer not with mourning but with a new budget. When the First Punic War began, Rome had no real fleet. Carthage owned the waves. So the Senate passed a decree. They took a single enemy warship that had run aground, measured it, copied it, and in 60 days a stand of timber became more than 100 hulls. They cut rowing benches into the sand of the shore and trained farmers to pull an oar in dry rows before they ever touched water. But Romans were not sailors, they were soldiers. So they bolted a soldier's weapon onto the deck. A boarding bridge called the corvus, the raven, 11 meters of heavy plank, hinged on a mast pole with an iron beak at the far end. The idea was crude and it worked. Drop the bridge, drive the spike through an enemy deck, pin his ship to yours, and send the legions across to fight the war they knew. It turned a sea battle into a land battle it won, until the sea reminded them it was not land. This is not the story of the 23-year war for Sicily, not the strategies of senators, not the careers of consuls. This is the story of 12 hours, one day inside a storm that snapped the neck of the raven and swallowed a generation of Roman seamen. We follow it through a man whose name is lost. His job was not a clerk, a keeper of records. His tablets were filled with the arithmetic of victory. Captured ships and plundered towns tallied in neat lines. He began that day counting profit. He ended it trying to price a wound so deep the Republic dealt it to herself. Tell me which city and country you're watching from in the comments below. And if you believe these stories deserve to be told, take a moment to subscribe and support this project. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. At 9 in the morning, the day is arithmetic. The sea off the southern coast of Sicily lies flat and pale. The sky is empty of cloud, and the world can be counted. On the command deck of the flagship, a junior clerk sits with his knees drawn up and his wax tablets balanced across them. He works for the fleet quaestor, the officer who tracks the money and the men. His name is not written anywhere that survived. He is a small gear in a large machine, and his task is not to make the day matter, but to record what the day contained, in even rows, so that Rome can read it later. His stylus moves across the blackened wax. He tallies a victory so complete it feels like the last page of the war. The proof surrounds him on every side. 364 masts stand between his ship and the horizon, a floating city of pitch and canvas, an army being carried home. The mood aboard is not loud, it is settled. The fighting is finished. The gods have been paid. and the ledger, which never smiles, agrees. He runs his eye back up the columns, the familiar catalogue of conquest, from the sack of Aspis on the African shore, silver by the talent, chest after chest of it stacked in the hold below him. 20,000 captives entered on the manifest with a single word beside them, markets, meaning the slave blocks of Sicily where they would be sold. He can hear them through the deck, a low collective murmur from the transport hulls. Human beings already converted into a figure. Arms and armor taken at Cape Hermaeum, enough to fit out 2 full legions. He had stood on the beach and counted the shields himself, each dented boss a Carthaginian who would not fight again. But the entry that mattered most was not treasure. It was people. Roman personnel embarked for evacuation, 24,000 legionaries, the survivors of the African campaign. They were the reason the whole armada existed, a rescue folded into a triumph. These men had followed the consul Marcus Atilius Regulus into Africa the year before to break Carthage, and had been broken instead. Regulus himself was already a prisoner. His army had been shattered on the plain at Tunis by a Spartan mercenary named Xanthippus, a hired professional who taught the Carthaginians to hold their war elephants until the Roman line came within reach, and then loose them into it. Cassius Dio and Polybius both record how completely that day undid a general who had refused Carthage's offer of peace because he thought the terms too soft on the loser. What Xanthippus left standing had crawled to the fortress of Aspis and held there, starving, waiting to die on a foreign coast. Rome did not leave them. The fleet had come, and off Cape Hermaeum it had met the Carthaginian navy in the water and beaten it in the open, taking more than 100 enemy ships before it ever reached the men on shore. Then it took the boys aboard. The clerk feels a clean, orderly satisfaction settle over him. The Republic protects its assets. The books balance. There is nothing in the wax that afternoon to suggest they will not stay balanced. His stylus stops on a name in the evacuation manifest. It pulls him backward, the way a single word can, to the beginning of all of it. To the briefing rooms in Rome years before, when this war was still only a shape on a map. Sicily, a wedge of land thick with grain, set in the water between Italy and the enemy. The trouble had started small in 264 BC, over a single city. Messana, on the northeast corner of the island, held by a band of Italian mercenaries called the Mamertines, who had seized it and murdered its men. Cornered, they begged 2 powers for help at once, Carthage and Rome, and both came. A quarrel over one stolen town lit a war that would burn for 23 years. Carthage held the sea. For 3 centuries her merchant navy had ruled the middle waters, and now her grip was closing on the island. Rome held the land. Her legions could march to the toe of Italy and then stop, because the road stopped, because water is not a road. They could stand on the shore and see Sicily. They could not reach it. That was the whole trap of the early war. A stalemate nailed in place by the sea. Carthaginian squadrons raided the Italian coast and slipped away before anyone could answer. Rome watched from the beach and could do nothing but watch. For a state built on moving forward, on swallowing one frontier and reaching for the next, this was intolerable. The machine had run out of ground to conquer. So it did what the machine always did when a tool was missing. It built the tool. It decided to have a navy. The clerk's memory turns to a different set of records now. Not the accounts of victory, but the accounts of production, the ones that had first made his reputation as a keeper of numbers. He remembers the reports that came out of the shipyards. So extreme they read like invention. A Carthaginian quinquereme, a warship rowed on 5 banks, the most advanced fighting machine afloat, had chased a Roman vessel too eagerly and run itself hard onto a sandbar. The Romans dragged it ashore intact, and they did not merely repair it, they copied it. Plank for plank, joint for joint, it became a template, a blueprint, treated almost as a holy object. There was a reason the copy was so exact. The Carthaginian shipwrights built by a system, each timber marked before assembly, so that a hull could be produced fast and identical, part fitting part. Centuries later, divers off Marsala would raise the wreck of a Punic warship and find those very marks still cut into the wood, letters guiding the builder like the numbered pieces of a thing meant to be mass-produced. Rome read that logic in the captured hull and copied the method along with the shape. The Senate handed down a decree that read less like a request than a factory order. 100 quinqueremes, 20 triremes built. Polybius, the Greek historian who set this war down a century later, and who had walked the ground and read the Roman archives himself, recorded the figure that still refuses to sound true. 60 days, from standing timber on the mountainsides to hulls floating in the water. 60 days. The clerk had handled a corner of those supply lists himself early in his career, and he had believed the numbers only because he was the one adding them up. Thousands of seasoned trunks hauled down from the hills by teams of oxen, the ruts still cut into those slopes. Pitch boiled in vats until the air near the yards was thick enough to chew, poured to seal the seams, iron by the ton, beaten into nails by every smith the Republic could conscript, their hammers going day and night, and the men, some 30,000 of them across the fleet, most of them farmers and goatherds who had never stood on a deck. They learned to row on dry land. The shipwrights cut rowing benches into the sand of the shore. Hundreds of them ranked as they would sit aboard. And there the coxswains taught landsmen the stroke, the pull, the recovery, the call and the answer, the burning of the shoulders. When it went on past the point, a man thought he could hold it. Rome was not raising sailors. Rome was raising infantry that could reach the enemy across water. It was the Republic's oldest reflex made new. If you lack the skill, drown the problem in mass and men until skill no longer decides it. Then came the weapon that would carry the day, and, in time, this day too. The clerk remembers the first drawings passed around, and the first working model tested inside the harbor while officers stood on the mole to watch. The corvus, the raven. It was an ugly thing that had no business on a warship. No sailor dreamed it. It came from the mind of a legionary engineer, a man who thought in siege towers, and it was in truth a siege engine bolted to a prow. Picture it, a wooden pillar, 7 meters tall, stepped into the deck near the bow. On top of the pillar, turning on a pivot, a long gangway, 11 meters from root to tip, wide enough for men to cross 2 abreast. Under the far end hung a heavy iron spike, forged and sharpened to a point, and shaped, the men said, like a bird's beak. A rope ran up through a pulley at the pillar's head and held the whole arm raised, so that from a distance the ship carried a strange raised limb against the sky. There is a cost hidden in that description, and no engineer failed to see it. All that timber and iron stood above the waterline, at the bow, where weight is most dangerous. In calm water, it was a genius. In a heavy sea, it made a ship top-heavy, slow to right herself, prone to bury her nose in a wave. The Raven had turned Rome into a sea power. It had also built a flaw into every hull that carried it. The use of it was simple, and that was the genius of it. A Roman ship drove straight at an enemy hull, not to swerve, not to ram, but to close. As the gap shrank, the crew cut the rope. The arm swung down, and the iron beak drove through the enemy deck and bit into the timber beneath. Now the two ships were one. Everything the Carthaginians did well, turning inside their opponent, ramming clean and pulling free, running down a beam to snap off a whole bank of oars, was made worthless in an instant, because you cannot maneuver a ship that has been nailed to another. And then the legions crossed the bridge, sword and shield, and did on that borrowed deck exactly what they did on land. The sea battle became a land battle stretched over water. It was crude. It was heavy. It won. It had won spectacularly and recently. Polybius tells us the Raven was blooded at Mylae in 260 BC, where the consul Gaius Duilius took a fleet of green crews against the Carthaginian admiral Hannibal Gisco, and captured or sank 50 ships. The enemy had never met the thing before. They watched the arms hang overhead and could not understand what they were until the beaks came down. Duilius took Rome's first naval triumph for it, and the city raised a column in the forum decorated with the bronze rams cut from the prows of the ships he had taken, a monument the Romans could see and touch, proof in metal that the sea could be won by men who fought like soldiers. Duilius earned another honor few remembered the reason for. For the rest of his life, a torch-bearer and a flute player escorted him home from dinner through the streets, a small state pension of dignity granted to the man who first beat Carthage at sea. The defeated admiral, Hannibal Gisco, went the other way. His own men, Polybius says, later crucified him for a separate failure. The Carthaginian answer to a commander who lost ships. Two navies, two ways of paying for defeat. That column in the forum was the reason the clerk's columns of numbers existed. The Raven had turned Carthage's advantage into Carthage's problem. On this channel, we spend our hours digging through the official record, the victory columns, the triumphant histories, the numbers cut in stone by the men who wanted to be remembered a certain way. But the truer story usually hides in the margins, in the quiet report of a functionary, in the note a clerk makes for his own protection, in the wreck on the seabed that says something the monument does not. Uncovering that takes a team and a community that wants the version behind the version. That community is the lineage. It is our membership, and it is the engine under everything you are watching. Join it, and you stop being only a viewer. You become part of the crew that keeps these deep dives alive, made to the standard they deserve, and you see them before anyone else. If you believe in pulling the dark, buried truths of history back into the light, click the Join button below and become part of the family. Join the lineage, 1,300 hours, 1 in the afternoon. The air changes. The clerk looks up from his tablets, and not because of a sound. It is the motion of the ship that lifts his head. The long, easy roll of the morning has gone sharp under him, a shorter, harder pitch, as if the sea has begun to lose its patience. The swell is coming from a new quarter, and the masts ahead of him are no longer sliding in unison. They have started to nod out of time, each hull answering the water on its own. On the forward deck, voices climb over one another. There were 2 consuls that year, sharing command of the fleet, Marcus Aemilius Paulus and Servius Fulvius Paetinus Nobilior. Both had reason to hurry. Both had triumphs to plan. It is Paulus arguing now with the ship's pilot. Paulus is a politician serving out his year in command, a man of the land enjoying the last stretch of a good campaign. The pilot is not Roman. He is a Greek from Sicily, who has read these waters his whole life, who knows their currents, and their moods, and their treachery, the way the clerk knows his columns. The pilot is not pointing at the sky, which is still clear enough to be reassuring. He is pointing at the land, at the low southern coast sliding past on their flank, the run below Camarina, a shore of shoals and rock with few places to shelter. He jabs his finger down at the chart and speaks with an urgency that has crossed into disrespect. And the clerk, who cannot hear every word from the command deck, understands the shape of it anyway. The pilot is talking about the wind, a gale out of the south that he can feel coming before it arrives, in the swell and in his own joints. He is naming the coast beside them a lee shore, the deadliest word a sailor owns, a stretch where a south wind takes a fleet and drives it bodily onto the rocks with no sea room to turn away. He is describing a trap and begging them to stand out into deep water while there is still time to run. He has cause to know it. This was the season the old sailors called closed. Roman practice and later Roman law held the sea unsafe from the setting of the Pleiades in autumn through the spring, and Vegetius, writing on such matters, marked the summer weeks around the rising of the dog star as their own kind of danger, the season of sudden squalls. It was July. The pilot was not inventing his fear. He was reading a calendar written in the sky. Polybius, weighing the whole disaster afterward, would lay the blame not on the storm, but on the men who commanded, officers who forced the pilots to run a dangerous coast in a dangerous month rather than delay a homecoming. It is one of the few places where the historian, who admired Rome, stops the narrative to say plainly that the commanders were wrong. The consul does not hear it, because the consul does not want to hear it. He has won a great victory. He has 24,000 rescued men aboard and an army to deliver home. He has a triumph waiting for him in Rome, the procession, the crowds, the name carried down to his grandchildren. He looks at a flat sea and a following breeze, and he hears the fear of a hired foreigner as one more obstacle between himself and his parade. The clerk watches Paulus lift a hand and wave the warning off, the small, tired gesture of a man ending a conversation he considers beneath him. The argument is over. The pilot walks back to the helm with his face shut like a fist. Under the deck, in the dark of the transports, the rescued men from Africa cannot see any of it. They know only that the pitch of the ship has hardened, that the water has begun to slap the hull louder than before, that a man near the oar ports has stopped talking. Most of them cannot swim. Roman legionaries seldom could. They had survived Xanthippus and his elephants and the long hunger inside Aspis, and they were being carried home in the holds of ships whose own oarsmen had learned their trade 2 summers ago on benches dug in sand. The fleet holds its course, running parallel to the coast, the land close on the right hand, and the clerk does the only thing a clerk can do. He reaches for a spare tablet, a clean one, and with the point of his stylus, he writes it down. The pilot's warning. The word lee shore. The consul's order to ignore it. He adds the date, he adds the hour. It is a small act of self-preservation dressed as diligence, a line set aside in case someone later needs to know who said what and when. He does not yet imagine who will read it, or that the man who gave the order will not be alive to answer for it. He blows the wax dry and slides the tablet under the others. The sun is still bright. The masts still march to the horizon in their orderly ranks, though not as evenly as they did an hour ago. Somewhere off to the south, the surface of the water has begun to darken and roughen in a long line, a shadow moving across the sea faster than any ship can row. It is a little past 1 o'clock. The wind is coming, 1,500 hours, 3 in the afternoon. The sea has stopped playing. The waves are not waves anymore. They are gray hills that move, their tops torn to white by a wind that keeps rising. The rhythm the clerk had lived inside all morning is gone, and in its place is only impact. The fleet that had marched to the horizon in ranks at dawn is coming apart into 364 separate fights, each hull alone with the water beneath it. The clerk has put his tablets away inside his tunic against his chest. Writing is finished. Standing is becoming a task in itself. He has both hands on a deck rail now, and through his palms he can feel the ship living, and it feels wrong. Every time the vessel slides down the face of one hill and meets the base of the next, there is a pause that should not be there. The prow dips. The timbers groan somewhere below the deck, a long complaint traveling the length of the keel. And then the ship is slow to lift. It does not rise with the sea the way a hull should. It shoulders into it, heavy at the head, and the water comes green over the bow before the bow can climb. A ship that fights the sea instead of riding it is a ship that is already losing. The clerk is not a sailor. He does not need to be one to read that. He looks out at the vessels near enough to see men on their decks. Every one of them is caught in the same struggle, and every one of them carries the same object at the bow. The corvus, the raven that won the war, is breaking the fleet's back in the open water, and the clerk can finally see the thing not as a weapon, but as a mistake made in wood and iron. A ton of timber and metal mounted high, forward, at the very place where weight does the most harm. The 7-metre pillar, the 11-metre arms swaying above it. He watches a quinquereme 2 lengths off roll and hang and roll back, and he understands, with a clarity that arrives too late for anyone, what a real sailor would have said the first time he saw the drawing. This is a land soldier's idea of a naval weapon. In a battle line, in calm water, the flaw was manageable. In a sea that strikes from the side, it is a sentence. The weight drags the ship over further than she should go, holds her down there an instant too long, opens her to the water. The sea is presenting its objection, and it is not the kind that can be waved off. On the deck below him, the rowers are being brought up in shifts, because to sit chained to a bench in a hull taking water is to drown sitting down. These were not slaves in the Roman fleet of these years, but citizens and allies, the poorest class of Rome, men enrolled for pay. And Polybius is careful to note it. The Republic put free men on those benches because it didn't yet have enough captives to spend. A single quinquereme carried near 300 oarsmen, packed close, and above them the marines and the deck crew, some 420 souls to a hull all told. Now they cling to whatever holds, salt in their eyes, hands raw from an oar that no longer answers the water. The coxswain's call, the pipe that set the stroke and ran their whole day, has fallen silent. Without it, the men have no rhythm, and the ship has no drive. It is the sound of order stopping. The deck lurches hard and throws him back in his own mind to another ledger, another report he had copied out years before. A victory dispatch from the waters off Mylae on the north coast of Sicily in 260 BC. He can nearly see it as the words had drawn it. The Carthaginian fleet, 130 ships, bearing down on the raw Roman navy. Their admiral was a nobleman named Hannibal Gisco, a man to whom the sea was a first language, and he looked at the Roman line, slow, square, manned by farmers, coming on in a neat row like infantry on a drill field, and he expected a morning's work and a slaughter. He was so certain of it, Polybius says, that his ships came on without order, each racing to be first at the killing. He gave the order. His ships surged, rams leveled at the hulls of amateurs. Then the ravens fell. The clerk remembers the dispatch describing the sound of it, a run of heavy percussive blows across the water as the arms came down one after another, and the iron beaks drove through the Carthaginian decks and locked there. He can imagine Gisco's face changing. The ships he was proudest of were suddenly stuck fast to the clumsy things they had meant to sink. The battle he had planned, the turning, the ramming, the shearing of oars, was over before it started. And then the second sound, legionaries crossing the bridges, shields up, into fights that were no longer naval at all, but boarding brawls fought a deck at a time, and the Carthaginian crews, superb at sea, were no match for men trained to do exactly this on land. 30 ships taken in the first pass. When the Carthaginians drew off and tried to circle back at the Roman flanks, the ravens simply pivoted on their poles to meet them from any side, and another 20 were caught. Gisco lost 50 ships that day, and his own flagship boarded, and the admiral went over the side into a skiff, rowing away from a fleet coming apart behind him. The weapon had worked past anyone's hope, and it had cost Gisco more than the ships. Polybius records that his own people later crucified him for a separate failure, the Carthaginian answer to an admiral who lost too much, carried out on the beach so the crews could see the price. That first victory pulls a warmer thing up with it, a memory from the clerk's own boyhood in Rome, the triumph of Gaius Duilius, the consul who had commanded at Mylae. It was the first naval triumph in the history of the city, and Rome received it with a relief close to hysteria, because for the first time the enemy's own element had been taken from them. The clerk was a boy in the crowd. He remembers Duilius riding, and the captured bronze rams carried past for the whole city to look at, still salt-stained. They cut those rams into a column in the forum, the columna rostrata, so that the victory stood in metal where men walked every day. The inscription on it boasted, in the old spelling, of the gold and silver taken and the ship seized, and Romans of later centuries would still stop to read it. But it was the small honor that stayed with the clerk. For the rest of Duilius's life, whenever he came home from dinner after dark, a man walked before him with a torch, and a second man walked beside him playing the flute. A torch-bearer and a flute-player every night to the end. It sounds almost like a joke. It was without precedent. It was the Republic thanking a man for handing it the sea, and every note of that flute in the dark was a hymn to the raven that had done it. Duilius came from no great family. That was part of it, too. Rome had raised an ordinary man to permanent honor because his weapon had done what centuries of noble commanders could not, and the old families in the Senate remembered it and resented it, and would not forget who the sea belonged to now. And the clerk had watched the raven's power grow, year over year, in his own hand, in his own columns. He had kept the accounts for the invasion of Africa and for the battle fought off Cape Ecnomus only months before this voyage. The numbers from that day still read like invention to him, though he had written them himself. The Roman fleet, 330 warships. The Carthaginian fleet, 350. Rowers and marines together, near 300,000 men in one stretch of water on a single day. By the count of heads, It was very likely the largest battle ever fought at sea. The two consuls of that year, Marcus Atilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius Vulso, had drawn their fleet into a wedge with the flagships at the point, and the Carthaginians under Hamilcar and Hanno had tried to split it and swallow the wings. It nearly worked. The Carthaginian center gave way on purpose to draw the Romans on. Then the wings closed like a mouth. But a ship that maneuvers into a Roman hull is a ship within reach of the Raven. And again, the beak decided it. Report after report. Carthaginian ships outsailing the Romans and being caught anyway, locked and boarded and lost. The clerk had set down the total with his own stylus. Enemy ships sunk, more than 30. Enemy ships captured, 64. Roman ships lost, 24. The road to Africa lay open. The Raven had eaten the enemy fleet. Ecnomus was the peak, the highest point the machine ever reached, the moment when the ugly, heavy, brilliant thing seemed to have made Rome unbeatable on the water. It carried Regulus and his legions across to Africa, to the sack of Aspis and the march on Carthage, to the peace terms he offered so harshly that the Carthaginians chose to fight on rather than accept them. It carried him to Xanthippus and the elephants and the ruin on the plain at Tunis, where the consul who had almost ended the war was taken alive and would die in captivity. The later Roman legend that Carthage sent Regulus home to argue for peace, and that he argued instead for war and returned to be killed. That story would be told and retold in Rome for centuries, a lesson in a Roman keeping his word to an enemy. Ecnomus was the root of all of it, and Ecnomus was the reason for everything around the Clark now. A victorious fleet crossing back with the survivors of that ruin in its holds. From a war the Republic still believed it had all but won. The clerk holds the rail and understands that he is watching the same weapon that built that peak begin to tip the fleet off it. It is in a moment like this, when a triumphant history is about to be rewritten by the water, that the original sources matter most. The fullest account of this war comes from the Greek historian Polybius, whose work, The Histories, is a masterpiece of military and political analysis, and the foundation for nearly everything we know about this conflict. It is the backbone of the research behind this script. If you want to grasp the true scale of the Roman war machine, you should own it. Just below the video, you'll see the View Products button. Tap it, and you'll find a link to the definitive edition of Polybius. Beside it, we've gathered a set of themed relics and dark memorabilia from the world of the Roman Republic. Open the shelf on your screen and explore the collection while the story runs. See which artifacts are waiting for you. 1800 hours, 6 in the evening, the gray turns to black. The wind is no longer a gale that a man leans against. It is a wall of moving air with weight behind it. Then the rain comes, and it does not come as drops. It comes as a single sheet of cold water driven flat across the sea, and the horizon disappears, and the ships around the flagship disappear, and the world shrinks to the groaning of the clerk's own hull and the roar wrapped around it. Whatever order had survived the afternoon is gone. It is every ship alone. The signal flags that had held the fleet together, the trumpet calls that passed the consul's orders from deck to deck, are useless now. No one can see a flag, and no horn carries against a wind like this. A fleet of 364 ships has become 364 strangers in the dark. And now, the last flaw of the Raven shows itself, the one no one had thought to fear. It does not only make the ship's top heavy, it makes a sail, a crude, fixed, uncontrollable sail bolted to the bow, exactly where a ship can least afford one. As the hills of water strike, The wind catches the flat face of the raised arm and the tall pillar behind it, and it drives the ship's head down. The prow is pushed under instead of allowed to lift. A hull built to climb the swell is being held by its own weapon and forced to dive into it. The Raven is drowning the ship it was made to defend. Some crews, the clerk will later hear, took axes to the pole and tried to cut the thing loose and heave it over the side, and could not clear it fast enough in the dark on a heaving deck with the wind against them. To save the ship, they had to destroy the very thing that had made the ship worth building. The Greek pilot's warning comes back to the clerk, and it is no longer the memory of an argument. It is a prophecy filling itself in, a lee shore, a trap. The wind is pushing the whole scattered fleet toward the unseen coast of Sicily, and there is nothing to be done about it. They cannot turn into the wind. The corvus makes the ships unsteerable. They cannot run before it. That carries them straight onto the rock they cannot see. They are pinned between the two. This was the stretch of coast between Camarina and Pachinus, the southeastern cape of the island, a shore of reef and shoal that Sicilian sailors avoided in fair weather. The fleet was being carried onto the worst ground on the whole passage. The pilot had known its name. He had said it aloud on the deck at 1 o'clock, and a politician in a hurry had waved it away with a tired hand. Down in the transports, the men from Africa are living the storm blind. They cannot see the coast the pilot feared. They know only that the hull rings when the sea hits it, that water is coming in around the oar ports, that the man beside them has stopped answering. These are the survivors of Regulus's army, men who lived through the elephants and the hunger inside Aspis, being carried home in the holds of ships their own oarsmen learned to row on benches dug in sand 2 summers back. Most of them cannot swim. Few Roman soldiers of these years could. They were farmers, not fishermen. The republic that saved them off the beach at Aspis is about to lose them within sight of home, and not one Carthaginian will have raised a hand to do it. There would be no enemy to blame, no admiral to crucify, no ram to hang in the forum, only weather and a decision. Then the clerk hears a sound he will carry for the rest of his life, and it does not belong to the storm. It comes from outside his own ship, a splintering crack loud enough to reach him over the wind. He turns into the gray and finds it. A quinquereme a short way off, her mast already gone, has rolled nearly onto her side. She struggles to come back up and cannot. The weight of her own raven is more than she can throw off. A wave taller than the rest takes her full on the beam. She drops into the trough. She does not rise. There is no fire and no crash of breaking, only a stretch of water where a ship of 500 men had been a breath before. Further out, another vessel's torch swings once in the dark and is gone. Then a third light, then no lights at all in that quarter of the sea, only the white tops of the waves showing where the ships had been. The clerk does not know it yet, standing there with the rain flat against his face and his tablets pressed to his chest. But Polybius will set down the count of this night in a single flat line that outdoes every battle of the war put together. He will write that, of 364 ships, only 80 came through. He will write that the coast for miles was buried under wreckage, and the dead so thickly that it could scarcely be approached. And he will name the cause without softening it. Not the storm, not the gods, but the commanders who forced the pilots to run a killing coast in a killing season rather than delay a homecoming by a week. It is one of the rare places where a historian who admired Rome stops the narrative to say that the men in charge were simply wrong. The storm has begun to collect what it is owed, and it has only just opened the ledger. 2100 hours, 9 at night. The world has narrowed to sound. There is no sea and no sky, only the shriek of the wind and the long groan of tortured wood beneath it. The clerk has both arms wrapped around a rail, his knuckles pale, his face raw from rain and blown salt. His eyes have stopped being useful. The dark is complete, cut only now and then by the swinging light of a torch on another ship as it lifts on a wave and drops back into nothing. He can no longer separate the sounds of his own hull from the sounds of others dying. A deep crack overhead might be a spar breaking above him, or it might be a hull splitting in two 100 meters off. The cries of men and the scream of the wind in the rigging have become the same noise. This is what it sounds like when a system comes apart. The tidy columns of the ledger have dissolved into this, and the raven, the mark of Rome's mastery, is feeding on the ships that carried it. A new sound cuts across the rest. The consul is shouting. Marcus Aemilius Paulus, the man who waved the pilot off at 1 o'clock, is screaming now at a handful of legionaries, his arm flung toward the bow. He wants the corvus gone. He wants it cut away. It is the one order left that makes sense. The weight that holds the ship's head down, that turns her broadside to the sea, must go over the side or they all go with it. 3 or 4 men take up axes and begin to crawl forward across a deck that will not hold still. The clerk watches them in a swinging lantern's light, a scene shown to him for a heartbeat at a time. It is not merely hard work. It cannot be done. The corvus was never bolted on as an afterthought. It was built into the ship. The 7-metre pillar is stepped deep through the deck into the beams of the hull, keyed and pegged, meant to take the shock of a boarding without tearing loose. The whole mass of it is oak and iron, joined with bolts as thick as a wrist, and now it is alive. The 11-metre arm, its holding rope long since gone, swings free with every roll, a pendulum of timber sweeping the foredeck end to end. A man reaches the pillar, sets his feet, lifts the axe, and the arm swings back and takes him off the deck into the black water. Whatever cry he made was gone before it left his mouth. The others fall back. The weapon cannot be disarmed. These ships will go to the bottom with the Raven still fixed to their bows, the invention and the men who built it sinking together. Somewhere below the clerk, in the flooding dark of the rowing decks, the oarsmen are living a different death. On a quinquereme, the lowest bank, the Thalamites sat close to the waterline, their oar ports stuffed with leather sleeves to keep the sea out. When a ship rolls hard and hangs, those sleeves fail first, and the water comes in at the level of the lowest benches before it reaches anyone above. The men on the bottom tier drown before the men on the deck know the hull is lost. 300 rowers to a ship packed on 3 levels, and the sea takes them from the bottom up. These are the citizens and allies Polybius says Rome enrolled from its poorest census class, men paid a wage to pull an oar, dying in the dark for a decision made in daylight by men they never saw. Above them, the Marines, 40 to a ship, in mail they cannot swim in, cling to the deck rails and wait their turn. 1 in the morning, the middle of the night. A wave larger than the others, and meaner, comes over the side as a single black wall and tears the length of the deck. The clerk's grip is broken. He is thrown against the mast, and something gives in his ribs with a hot, cracking pain. The small satchel at his belt, the wax tablets, the stylus, the tools that make him what he is, all of it is ripped away and taken by the water. He watches it go and feels nothing about it. His function is finished. A record keeper with nothing left to record is only a man on a dying ship, his life now measured in the space between one wave and the next. And in that gap, with the mast at his back and his lungs full of salt, his mind does not go to the gods or to his family waiting in Rome. It goes to the manifest, to the 24,000 names, the survivors of Africa, the men who had watched their comrades trampled under Carthaginian elephants and cut down by the mercenaries of Xanthippus on the plain at Tunis. Men who lived through a defeat that should have killed them, who held on inside the walls of Aspis until the fleet came, who were promised the one thing a soldier wants at the end of a lost campaign: passage home. Everything the clerk had counted that morning was being undone by a single afternoon's decision. The silver, the captives, the armor of 2 legions, the pride of the departure. Rome had pulled an army out of the enemy's hand, carried it halfway back, and was now handing it to the sea instead. Not to Carthage, to the water, and to a man in a hurry. Dawn does not arrive as a sunrise. It arrives as the dark slowly thinning to gray. The wind drops, the rain stops. The waves fall away into a long, heavy, oily swell that lifts and lowers the wreckage without malice. The violence is spent. What replaces it is worse in its own way. A silence that stretches for miles. The clerk drags himself upright, bruised, half drowned, one side of him a single ache. His ship is still afloat. Dismasted, low, crippled, but afloat. He is a survivor, and he had not thought he would be. He looks out over the water and reads it the way he once read a column of figures. The sea to the horizon is a flat field of debris, splintered planks, snapped oars, ribbons of sail, the floating shapes of men and pack animals turning slowly on the swell. The Sicilian coast stands clear now, the cliffs and beaches below Camarina heaped with the wreck of the largest fleet the world had yet assembled. The shore here runs low and open toward the mouth of the little river Hyparis, below the old Greek colony of Camarina, and for a stretch of that coast a man could have walked from one hull to the next without touching sand. Here and there other ships lie broken along the beaches, a few dozen of them, and small figures move at the tide line, pulling at wreckage, searching, dragging what they find above the water. Out of 364 vessels, 80 came through the night. The clerk does not weep and does not pray. He finds a lump of charcoal and a strip of torn sailcloth. His work, it turns out, is not over after all. He begins a new ledger, a ledger of the dead. It is the only thing he knows how to do, and it is the thing the machine will want from him when he reaches shore. It will want a number, the number Polybius set down, weighing every estimate he could find, was that more men died in this single night than in any sea disaster the ancient world had ever recorded. The figure that gives this day its place in every account written since. Diodorus Siculus, a Sicilian who knew this coast, would put the losses at 340 ships, and a count of dead so large he treated it as a wound the Republic never fully explained. There is a detail the clerk cannot yet know, sitting on that ruined deck. The 2 consuls of the year, Paulus and Servius Fulvius Nobilior, both lived. They came home from the worst maritime catastrophe in the Republic's history, and the state that crucified admirals in Carthage did not so much as strip them of office. Fulvius Nobilior went on to hold the censorship years later, the highest honor the Republic could give. The machine that could log 100,000 drowned as a deficit did not think in terms of one man's guilt. it thought in terms of the next fleet. And there is a bitter symmetry the clerk would have appreciated. This same fleet, before the storm, had carried home the captured Carthaginian ships and the spoils of a won campaign. The victory and the disaster rode in the same hulls. The books that morning had been in profit. By dawn, the same ships had turned the largest surplus of the war into its largest loss. The disaster off Camarina was so complete and so plainly self-inflicted that it bent the whole course of Roman naval practice. The corvus, the celebrated war winner, the beak that broke Carthage at Mylae and Ecnomus, is never named in the surviving sources again. It simply vanishes from the record. The Republic had learned what it costs to bolt a siege engine to a ship and call it a fleet. It had learned it in a single night, from a clerk's charcoal count and thousands like it laid before the Senate. The learning was expensive, and it did not stop there. 2 years later, in 253 BC, a Roman fleet of 150 ships was caught in a storm on its way back from a raid on the African coast and torn apart off this same southern shore. In 249 BC, the consul Publius Claudius Pulcher told before the Battle of Drepana that the sacred chickens would not eat, and so gave no favorable omen, ordered them thrown into the sea. If they will not eat, he is said to have snapped, then let them drink, and then lost 93 of his 123 ships in a single morning to the Carthaginian admiral Adherbal. He was recalled to Rome, tried, and disgraced, the first Roman commander condemned for impiety toward the auspices. His sister Claudia, the story went, later complained aloud in a crowded street that she wished her brother were alive to lose another fleet and thin the mob that jostled her, and she was fined for the words. His colleague that year, Lucius Junius Pullus, lost most of what was left, another 120 warships, to a fresh storm off Cape Ecnomus, and took his own life rather than stand the same trial. Inside a single decade, Rome had lost 4 great fleets and well over 100,000 men to weather, to bad command, and to the enemy in turn. Any other power in the ancient world would have sued for peace, or simply ceased to be one. Carthage, watching disaster follow disaster, must have believed the war already won. They had misread the machine. Rome's real weapon was never the raven's beak. It was the state's capacity to swallow loss and keep walking. Carthage fought with hired soldiers she had to pay and a fleet she could not replace. Her wealth came from trade, and trade needs peace to pay its way. Rome fought with the manpower of all Italy, hundreds of thousands of men on the census rolls liable for service, and a treasury that logged catastrophe as one more line to be funded. So Rome learned. It set the corvus aside for good. It studied the captured hulls again, the way it had studied the first one run aground years before, and it built lighter, faster quinqueremes, this time on the lines of a blockade runner taken from a Carthaginian captain the Romans called Hannibal the Rhodian, whose ship was so fast they could not catch her until she too grounded on a shoal. It drilled its crews until they stopped being legionaries who happened to be afloat and became sailors who could turn inside an enemy and ram him clean, the very thing the corvus had once let them avoid learning. The last battle came in 241 BC off the Aegates Islands at the western tip of Sicily, in sight of the harbors of Drepana and Lilybaeum, where the war had ground to a standstill on land. The new fleet had not been paid for by the state at all. The treasury was empty after 20 years of war, but by forced loans from the richest men in Rome, senators and knights, who each advanced the cost of a warship against the promise of repayment from the spoils. 200 ships raised on private credit because the Republic itself was out of money and would not stop. That fleet, under the consul Gaius Lutatius Catullus, wintered off the islands and caught the last Carthaginian fleet as it crossed from Africa, heavy with grain and supplies, its crews raw before it could reach its own starving army on the island. There was no bridge and no boarding brawl. It was decided by seamanship alone, in a hard wind that this time the Romans knew how to use. They outturned and outfought them, sank 50 ships and captured 70, and pulled nearly 10,000 men from the water into chains. The defeated Carthaginian commander, Hanno, was recalled home and crucified for it. Carthage asked for terms and agreed to pay Rome 3,200 talents of silver over 10 years. The war that had begun over one stolen town 23 years before was over, and Sicily became the first Roman province beyond Italy. And centuries later, the proof of that last day began to come up off the seabed. Divers and archaeologists working the waters off the Aegates found the bronze rams, wrenched from the prows of ships as they went down, lying in the sand at 100 meters and more, where they had fallen 22 centuries before. They are nothing like the corvus. They are sleek, shaped, engineered to cut water and split timber at speed, each cast to a fixed weight the shipyards could certify. And many of them are inscribed. They carry the names of the Roman magistrates, the quaestors, the men who approved the contracts, and stamped the metal to declare the work sound. One ram raised from those islands still reads that the quaestors examined it and passed it fit. Functionaries, men who kept ledgers, men exactly like the clerk who lived through the night off Camarina, their signatures riding into the last battle of the war on the very point of the weapon that finally won it. The helmets found beside them, Roman and Carthaginian together in the same field of sand, do not say which side each man died for. Only the rams keep their records. That is the final truth of Roman power, and it is colder than any storm. The corvus was a clever, violent trick that won battles, and it was not the real weapon. The real weapon was the system. It was the unfeeling bureaucracy that could fill a tablet with 100,000 dead and read it not as grief, but as a shortfall to be made good. It was the Senate that could hear an entire fleet had ceased to exist and answer not with mourning, but with a motion to raise a tax and build another. It was the willingness to let 2 consuls walk home from the worst night in the Republic's history and simply issue fresh orders in the morning. The raven was only a tool, and tools can fail. The instrument that actually won the war was the ledger itself, and behind it, a state's terrible readiness to bear any cost, pay any price in blood, turn the page, and keep counting until the enemy could count no longer. The clerk's name did not survive. His arithmetic did. Somewhere in the figures Polybius drew on a century later, in the tallies of ships built and ships lost, and men who did not come back, the work of men like him is still being read 2,000 years on. He began that day counting the profits of a victory, silver by the talent and captives by the 1,000. He ended it kneeling on a broken deck below Camarina, inventing a new column for the drowned with a lump of charcoal on a scrap of sail. And the Republic, when it received his figures, did what it always did. It read the shortfall, it balanced the books, and it built again. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the shore. If it moved you, take a second to subscribe, to like this video, and to send it to one person who would understand why it matters. You've just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. There is another story already waiting for you. The video rising onto your screen right now is where this journey continues. Click it. Keep going.